When Google Translate launched its free online neural-machine translation system in 2016, people were amazed by how good the output was. Many users claim that machine translations are now indistinguishable from human translations. And while it's true that the output is often incredibly good, machine translations are almost never without errors, and it's important to stay critical and cautious. The output produced by neural-machine translation systems is often so fluent and idiomatic, it sounds natural and really nice, that it's hard for people to spot the errors, especially if you have little to no knowledge of the original language. Because these translations read fluently, people assume that they're also correct. But even the best performing systems will still make mistakes. And sometimes the machine even hallucinates, producing words and sentences in your translation that simply weren't there in the original. Before you use machine translation, it's therefore wise to consider whether using it is the right choice. Is it the right tool for your text and for your language combination? What do you want to do with the translation? And what will the consequences be if the translation is of poor quality or contains errors? Will the translation need to be checked and corrected? And will you be the one who's able to do this? Do you really need to use machine translation? Or is there a better, safer alternative? Just remember that most of these systems are free, but in fact you're paying with your data. When you close the browser or the app, your translation and the original aren't gone. Your data is stored in the cloud and may be used to further improve the system, or it may be sold to a third party. This is all stated in the terms of use, but we hardly ever read these. Just make sure you know what you're sharing. Never put sensitive, private or confidential information into a machine translation app. The first decision we have to make is whether we want to use machine translation to either obtain information or provide information. So let's look at obtaining information first. Imagine a scenario in which your course instructor asks you to read an academic article and you find the English or German or Russian or Korean rather difficult to understand. Or you come across a source during your reading that looks useful, but it's in Portuguese or Finnish and you simply don't have any knowledge of that language. This is when you can use machine translation to read and understand the text. This is called gisting, because you simply want to get the gist, the essence of the text. You don't need to understand it in all of its details and nuances. A rough and ready translation, even with the occasional errors and awkward sentences, is fine, as long as the translation is good enough for you to be able to understand its main message. Of course, you still need to think about the risk of errors interfering with your understanding. You should carefully reflect on how much you know about the subject matter, because this will help you determine whether the information is correct. And if you have at least some knowledge of the original language, it will be easier to spot mistakes. It often helps to try different engines rather than just one. Remember that the output depends on the data the engine was trained on, so different engines sometimes give very different translations. Most engines also work much better if English is one of the languages involved. So you may want to try translating that Portuguese source into both Dutch and English and compare the results. It also helps if you increase your knowledge of the typical mistakes that machine translation engines make. This will allow you to anticipate errors. For example, if you're using machine translation to translate an academic text, it helps to know that machine translation struggles with long and complex sentences, and it's better at translating active sentences than passive ones. For spoken or informal language, on the other hand, it's usually the lack of context or the use of slang or colloquialisms that proves problematic for the machine. While in news texts and literary texts, idiomatic expressions in metaphorical language may lead to overly literal or culturally inappropriate translations. Similarly, It helps if you know what the typical characteristics of the languages you're using are. If you know that your input language doesn't use pronouns or doesn't mark gender, then you also know that Google Translate will simply be guessing, and it will be randomly inserting pronouns and assigning genders based on what is common in the data. If you are using ChatGPT, you may want to ask questions about anything that catches your attention or strikes you as odd. Just be aware that your system may be biased, because the data may be biased. And then there's using machine translation to provide information. For example, to write an email or a paper, perhaps even your bachelor's thesis. In this case, you will not be happy with a rough and ready translation that is understandable but contains errors. You want the translation to be of human quality and to be free of both content and language errors. Of course, this will be easier to do if you have a good command of both of the languages involved. One question this raises for students is, of course, whether instructors allow the use of machine translation for this purpose, or whether they consider it cheating. This becomes an even bigger question for students who are studying a particular language, say German, Korean, or Portuguese, and they want to use machine translation to improve their writing skills. If you're using ChatGPT, you can ask the system to revise your text and explain the changes it makes. Our advice is to always be explicit and transparent about your use of machine translation and other AI tools. Discuss when and how you may or may not use them together with your instructors. If you do decide to use machine translation, use it critically and with caution. As my colleague said in the video on large language models, you cannot outsource your thinking to them, nor should you want to. Machine translation is a very useful tool, but it doesn't actually read or understand your text. It knows nothing about politeness, humor, implicit meaning, taboo, cultural references, or metaphor. It can mimic human communication and produce very fluent sentences, but it will turn a lawyer into an avocado, a male nurse into a verpleegster, and a formal VU into an informal tu in the blink of an eye.